Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jay Parsons, professor and farm and ranch management specialist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Today is part of our center's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon Central. You can check out our full schedule at our website, which is cap.unl.edu. With a majority of the Nebraska range and pasture condition, or pasture in poor or very poor condition to start off our grazing season, we have many producers that are considering the availability of alternative forage resources to get them through this production year. Annual Forages planted on cropland offers a potentially valuable feed resource while fulfilling crop rotation needs. Today, we will discuss planting dates, seeding mix, and expected forage production for various scenarios with a focus on conditions this year that we are seeing. We'll also talk about grazing and timing of forage availability, along with options for obtaining crop insurance through the annual forage insurance plan to help cover the production risk associated with annual forages. Joining me today is Mary Drewnoski, an associate professor and beef systems specialist here at UNL. So welcome, Mary, and it's glad to have you on, and we'll go ahead and get started here with my slides, if I could get them shared correctly.
And I'll just mention that if you guys think of a question as we are going, just throw it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye out too for it so that we can just have a conversation. So don't be shy. Let us know what you're thinking, what you're wanting to know more about, and we'll make sure we discuss it.
Okay, are you seeing the slide or the dual slide thing?
The presenter view, yeah. Switch display.
Sure you guys could see the right one. Is that better?
Excellent.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started here then. So we're going to go over some tips for it, and of course, one of the big issues to start us off here. Why is my slide not advancing? There we go. Is the current drought conditions, and so this is our current drought map throughout the state. And of course, white is where we don't have a drought, and for those of you in the extreme southeast, you're the small portion of the state that's not considered to be at least abnormally dry. And so really the severity of it starts at the far southwest quarter, where we have an extreme drought in place over several counties, and then kind of goes from bottom left to top right as far as the severe ban through the state. And the bottom line is that we got forage and range conditions are not real good right now. Matter of fact, roughly 40 to 50% of our range in the state is classified as poor or very poor conditions to start off with. And so that's presenting some interest then in how we're going to get our cows through the season. And of course, some of you that are tracking some of the cow sales right now know that cow sales are running about 40% above last year, which last year was also above 2020. So we're seeing quite a few cows being sold off just because we simply do not have the forage out there, and cow prices are pretty high. So if you're able to maintain your cow numbers through this basically I don't want to call it a forage crisis, but certainly a squeeze on the amount of forage available, you may be able to come out ahead in the long run, because we're reducing inventories, which usually is a positive for cattle prices. So Mary, I don't know if you have anything to add on this map situation, things you've seen in the state, but go ahead and do it if you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you mentioned is really good, Jay. One thing I will point out is, right, we have pasture, and pasture is in poor condition, but we also have limited availability and high commodity prices. So currently it's hard to find grass hay. Grass hay, if you can find it, $150, $160, $200 a ton. Alfalfa, again, is kind of hard to find, but $200 to $300 a ton. And distillers is also very high at $300 for dry, and maybe modified. I think I've been seeing about $150. So there's a lot of options, right, for trying to maintain the cow herd. One is, of course, you try to stretch your grass as much as you can. Another is to lock them up and feed them. And then the third one, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today, is annual forages. And admittedly, this year, everything's expensive, but you got to look at the options relative to each other.
Yeah, so this is some different annual forages, planting dates and timing of them. And Mary, I want you to go ahead and go through these if you wouldn't mind, because you've had a lot of experience with producers actually implementing these, in particular, looking at the grazing options for their cattle.
Yeah, I think one of the things that gets underestimated is just how important timing of planting is, and species selection. So the first thing you'll probably notice if you just look in the second column here and you look at kind of what I have written down, you see a lot of grass. And one of the key things of thinking about annual forages is if you're looking for biomass, grasses are king. And so one of the first things I always tell somebody is when they're planting, don't skimp on the grasses, regardless of when you're planting them, because you can get very complex in your mixes, but grass is going to make up the majority of the biomass and is also usually the most cost-effective feed resource. So you can add legumes, you can add other things into the mix, but don't skimp on the grass. The other thing here, as I point out on timing, is that if we select the right type of species for the right planting time, you're going to come out a lot more ahead. And so there's two common things I see people do. One is that they plant something that they think they're going to get fall grazing out of, and they plant it too late in the season. I mean, we're in June right now, and June is a prime time to plant warm season summer annuals like Sudan grass for grazing. That's kind of my preferred grazing species. If you're going to do hay, maybe that's sorghum Sudan, or if you wanted to do, say, silage, maybe it is going to forage sorghum. But if you think about it, really anytime between about May 15th and August 1st, those warm seasons are going to give you the most biomass possible and the most AUM, so the most amount of grazing possible. So right now, if you have some crop ground that you haven't planted something in, or if you were one of the victims of hail this week, and you're thinking that it's not worth replanting, that might be an option to consider, is to put in a warm season like Sudan grass. And thankfully, most Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan, most of those, and forage sorghum, you can plant and there's no plant back restrictions with the herbicides you're typically using on corn, which is also a bonus. And then you can graze them this summer, or you can stockpile them and graze them in the winter. There's various options there. The other thing I wanted to point out is if you can, for instance, you got wheat or something in the ground and you're going to come out in July, you can wait and plant something like oats and brassicas, and they'll be very, very high quality, and they can be great feed for lactating cows or for your growing calves if you want to retain them. And we're going to talk more about these in a little while, but I really just wanted to set up that we can basically fill any grazing gap we want to with annuals. It just kind of depends on your goals and when you have cropland available. And we do have a planting guide, tells you planting dates, it tells you seeding rates, it gives all the suggestions for things that you probably want to know about. And that's on the slide here. You can just go to that website, and it's got a lot of quite useful information there.
Yeah, and Mary, you mentioned the hailstorm, and I know I've heard at least a lot of stories, don't have documented numbers, but a lot of people lost their first cutting of hay or lost a cutting of hay with that hailstorm. And we already have really tight hay supplies on top of the pasture conditions. And as you already mentioned, some of the costs involved. So a lot of things kind of coalescing around this. But that brings us to some of the production risk. And, and with these annual forages, a lot of people aren't aware that there is an annual forage insurance plan that does apply to them. And so I want to spend a few minutes just updating people on that if you're not aware of it, and show you how it has been used in the state, in particular the last couple of years. It's not tied directly to the actual production, which is a little odd for people to think of. So it is tied, it's what we call an index policy, and it's indexed to basically precipitation. So it falls in the category what we call rainfall index insurance. So it's based off of historical data for a grid, and that grid is 0.25 degrees longitude by 0.25 degrees latitude, which means absolutely nothing to most of the people, including me. But suffice it to say, in Nebraska, that grid is roughly 12 miles wide by 16 miles tall, north to south, across most of the state of Nebraska. And so historically, there's data that is produced on that rainfall data that goes back to 1948. And so they basically use that to project an average rainfall, and you're ensuring what percentage of that rainfall actually comes down. So the highest you can insure is 90% of the average. And if we are short on rainfall, let's just say you're at 50% of the average for a 2-month interval. We'll go over this here in a second, but if you're short of that, so then you get paid on it. So it might look something like this. Let's just say that you insured at 75% coverage of the average rainfall, and it ended up that index turned out to be 44% of the actual. The gap here is 31%, and that's what they would multiply by the dollar value you had insured to actually provide you with an indemnity payment. And the theory behind it is that especially in the dry land situation, the production that you'll actually get off of these acres is highly dependent upon the rainfall that you receive. So it's not perfectly correlated. Obviously, there's some basis risk there between the actual rainfall that comes down and what you have for production. And certainly within a grid, there's some basis risk in terms of what you experience on your particular field versus what the entire grid, because the index is calculated for the grid. But it is a policy that is available for people to help cover some of the at least precipitation risk associated with planting annual forages. And like many insurance, it's heavily subsidized. So if you're familiar with the pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, which a lot of cattle producers are, this is very similar to that. I would call it a sister insurance program. Whereas pasture, rangeland, and forage is for perennial forage, this would be for annually planted forage. But very similar to that, it's based off of the same index, same idea that you can insure 2-month intervals throughout what is presumed to be the growing season for the annual forage. And that's one of the trickiest parts about using this thing is just realizing that it's available and when it might apply, and then of course how you actually take it out. So I'll spend a couple of slides here just kind of going through the mechanics of it. It is available for annual crops that are planted for use for livestock feed or fodder. So that means that you intend to either graze it or hay it or chop it or any combination of that. The main thing is that you intend to use it for livestock feed, okay? And so that opens up the door, makes you eligible for it. It does work just like PRF in terms of its 2-month rainfall index intervals that you're insuring, and you can insure up to 90% of that normal precipitation. One of the trickiest parts, and one of the reasons for doing this webinar now, besides our current production situation, is the sign up deadline is July 15th. So we have about a month here that you would sign up for it. The production year for it runs from July 16th all the way through July 15th of next year. So if you're planning on planting annual forages anytime in that window from mid-July this year to mid-July of 2023, and you want to get this insurance, you got to sign up for it by July 16th. I'll go through that here in a moment, how that fits. This isn't widely known throughout the country and not widely talked about throughout the country because it's not available everywhere. It's basically available in Nebraska, and you go north to Canada, south to Texas, and throw in Colorado and New Mexico. Those are the only states where this is actually available for people to buy. So if you're on our left or right wings, Iowa, Missouri, Wyoming, those lands aren't even eligible for this. So Nebraska is a little bit of a unique situation in terms of having this available. Now it is available for anything planted from July 16th through July 15th. So we'd be going from July 16th of 2022 through July 15th of 2023. They break it up into 4 growing seasons based on quarters. And then based off of when you plant, okay, I should say planting seasons based off quarters. They call them growing seasons, but it's really triggered by planting dates. So anything from July, the 3-month period from mid-July to mid-October would qualify as growing season 1, and then you can insure precipitation from September 1 all the way through the end of March. Okay, and so that's the eligible precipitation window that you have to insure. Now, Mary mentioned that you might be planting something, say in mid-July, with the intent to use it in the fall. But you can actually insure rainfall all the way into March. So especially in a dry land situation, if you're out in the midsection or the western part of the state, you might be worried about soil moisture for the subsequent year. You can actually, insure some of that spring moisture all the way into March as a hedge, right? In case planting a forage now and actually using it through the fall affects soil moisture in the spring for something that you want to plant next year. So that's the trickiest part about it, is realizing that you have to plan ahead. You have to talk to your crop insurance agent and say, hey, I want this coverage for these seasons and so on. That doesn't lock you into a premium, because similar to corn insurance or wheat insurance or whatever, you basically make your selection on what you want insurance for now, and then you report the acres when you actually plant and say, I want to cover this many acres. So if you look on the data, there's a lot of people that quote unquote purchase this policy, but they don't actually pay premiums on it because they don't actually plant something in those particular time frames. So there's more policies sold than there are policies where premiums are paid on this particular product. But you have to make up your mind between now and July 16th if you want to use it. So I'll just show you a very quick example of it. And this is for a grid. This is just north of Kearney. So Kearney's down here actually in a different grid for the most part. So you're going basically from the northern edge of Kearney, about 16 miles north. And then of course, this is about 12 miles wide. But I just put a dot here near Pleasanton. It doesn't really matter, but it's in the middle of this grid, which is 25024 in Buffalo County. And an example of a coverage, what this might look like for growing season 1. So this would be something that you plant between July 16th and October 15th. Might look something like this. So you would go in and you'd say, all right, I want to get coverage for growing season 1, 90% of the rainfall coverage at what we call the productivity factor, which is basically a percentage of the base value per acre. So Buffalo County had a base value per acre of $210, and you would say, I want to insure 100% of that. You can go up to 1.5 times that if you want to go a higher dollar value on it. So that 90% coverage would put you basically with protection at about $189 an acre. This is growing season 1, so you can insure from September all the way through the end of March, but you're insuring 2-month intervals. So somewhere in there, you're going to leave a month uncovered. And so I just did an example here of 40%. You can put up to 40% of the coverage in any 2-month intervals. And then you pretty much have to distribute the rest. So you end up covering 6 out of the 7 months. It's just a matter of the combination, how you want to do it. So I spread it out fairly evenly here with 40, 30, and 30. And all that does is take the $189 of coverage and distribute it. The premium rates are based off of their expectations of paying out. And so November, December is the riskiest month for them. So they're going to charge you 32% basically premium on that, because that's what they expect to pay out based off of historical data. So that puts that premium at $18.54 per acre. And then for the other months, it's a little cheaper to insure at $16 and $11. And again, that's based off of the dollar value there, and then also their expectations for paying out. So the bottom line here is this total premium on $189 worth of coverage would be $45.70. The government at this level pays 51% of that. So the producer would be basically signing up for coverage at $22.39 for their portion of the premium. Now, how has this worked over the years? I just did 20 years worth of data here. So I'm going from 2002 through 2021 for this season. And on average, that $22.39 premium per acre had an average indemnity of just about $33 an acre, which is about 1.5 times of what's paid into it, which should make sense because the government's paying half of your premium for you, right? So you should come out ahead over the long haul. One of the things I always point out to people, and they're always interested in this, is how often does my indemnity cover my premium? In other words, how often do I come out ahead on this? And in this particular coverage that I put in place, 3/4 of the time, your indemnity covered your premium. And if you look through the years here, there were a couple of years, 2018 and 2004, where there was no indemnity paid out. Okay, so we were always at 90% or above for all of those 6 months that we had insured there. Those 3 different intervals. The 3 other ones that we didn't cover it. There was 2015, where it was $13.50, 2007 at $8 indemnity, 2003 was $15 indemnity. So it's not like we had to pay all of that premium ourselves. It covered part of it. And all the rest of them, it covered it, although there were some years where it barely covered it, like 2020 and 2019. Last year, of course, the 2021 year, more than well over double. Look at 2012 was really dry, $79 come back. 2002, $93 come back. So there'll be some variation in how it pays out or doesn't pay out, but the whole idea is it helps compensate you when you're dry. So just one comment for those of you that grow winter wheat, because this dual use option was just added. You can cover winter wheat with this policy plus a small grains policy. Of course, you'd have to sign up for that by July 15th if you're thinking of doing that this fall. And the way it works is your small grains policy is, as long as you follow accepted production practices, it would be normal. But you can get annual forage coverage, but it's basically every number that I just displayed there would be put in at 40%, basically. So you only get 40% coverage, you only have to pay 40% of the premium and so on and so forth. So basically everything is scaled down to 40% of normal because you plan to just graze it a little bit and still harvest it for grain. So that is available in Nebraska, and you can make use of that if you want. So just to sum up here at the end on how this is being used, we've seen a big uptick on this. It's only been available since 2014, so this is the entire history of it here in Nebraska. And over the last couple of years in particular, we've basically seen use of this double. We see the acres pretty much triple that people are using it, and some of that is triggered just by the fact that it paid off so heavily in 2020. Okay, and so these are basically for $1 premium. This is what producers have been paid out in the last 3 years on this. 2022, we still have a few months left of coverage here, so this number will actually go a little bit higher. Matter of fact, I can tell you in the last week, when I pulled these numbers about a week ago, this was $600,000. So there was about $400,000 worth of indemnities paid out just recently, reported, at least in the data. I'm not sure the exact data went out to producers. But in any case, this reflects a lot of the dryness that we've been seeing, and a lot of the interest that some of this is because people are planting more annual forages, more aware of this, and then some of it is just that it's been dry, and so they become aware of it. This is one of the most often questions I get asked: should I always insure at the 90% coverage level? I can tell you most people are. Okay, so for 2022, of those 24 policies that people have paid premiums on, 23 have been indemnified, and pretty much all but 2 of them have been insured at the 90% level. But what I traditionally see is that people that insure at the lower level, of course, their premiums are cheaper. They tend to have a higher producer loss ratio. And some of that is just because when it's dry, it's dry. So everybody, you'll notice on here, there's not a lot of difference on who's getting paid. Everybody is getting paid. But there's dollar value difference in terms of how it actually goes out in nets per acre. But most people are insuring at the 90% level, but we do see quite a few outliers in each year that'll go down to that 70, 80% level of coverage. So just to make people aware of that, that is an option out there to help you insure that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Mary, and she's going to talk about some of the production.
Yeah, so I thought one of the things that I would do was just kind of start in on some of my thoughts and some tips about using annual forages. And again, just feel free to chime in with questions, because I'd like to answer your questions and make sure you're getting the information you're looking for. So I thought where I would start, because this is where we're at right now, is talking about the warm season summer annuals and giving you some ideas about species selection. So what I have on here is basically estimates of yields that we'll get for some of the common summer annuals that we might suggest. So the first one you have on here is forage sorghum, and that is suggested for silage. And it will be your highest yielding silage other than, of course, corn silage. But one of the nice things about forage sorghum is it doesn't need nearly as much water. So that's an advantage for this year. Typically, it's not going to be as high quality. It's on average, we say it's about 90% the energy value, and fairly similar in protein. The next one that I have on the list is sorghum Sudan, and I think most people are probably familiar with sorghum Sudan. And it's typically either used as hay or silage. It's not the best for grazing because it doesn't do as good a job of regrowth. But you can use it for grazing, particularly if you're going to want to stockpile, because it will produce more biomass than, say, Sudan grass when it's a one-cut system, or in this case, a one-graze system. So some people will use that to go ahead and even do something like swath grazing, and sorghum Sudan works really well for that. One little hitch in the giddy up for sorghum Sudan and Sudan grass is that both of those produce prussic acid. So when they get a frost, they produce a toxin for 7 days after the killing frost. So during the frost period, you really can't be grazing them. So if you're looking at wanting to graze really during, let's say, late September through, the mid October, that's where pearl millet can come in. And pearl millet often can yield about as well as sorghum Sudan grass. It doesn't regrow quite as well as Sudan grass for grazing, but it works really nicely if you really are looking for something to fit that window of, that September to October grazing, because you don't have any prussic acid risks. The other thing about pearl millet that I think a lot of people, they think of all millets as the same, and there's a lot of different millets out there. So the two most common that are used are foxtail and pearl millet. Pearl millet, I like people to think about it more like sorghum Sudan. It's very high yielding. It's a later maturing. It doesn't like wet feet. So it likes conditions that are drier. And in drier conditions, it actually can yield a little bit better than sorghum Sudan. So that's kind of handy to know. Foxtail millet is something that for those out in the West, you might be familiar with it. It's a very short growing season, like 60 days to maturity. You can also see that it's a lot lower in yielding. But there's some great things about foxtail millet in that it fits really short windows. When, let's say, you came off with wheat and you want to do something for hay, foxtail millet probably can squeeze in there and actually get a hay crop off. It's also cheap. It is one of the cheapest seeds that you can get. And so it's pretty low risk. So in cases where you are on dry land and we are dry and you're like, it may or may not produce, your biggest cost is really getting the seed into the ground. And so you could put it in that case and just see what happens. So there's a risk there that it won't take, but that's less than, say, pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, or Sudan grass. They're all about usually like $20 an acre is pretty common seed cost for those guys. And for foxtail millet, you're looking at about half that to $5, depending on where you go. Teff is another option. It's typically used for hay. It is kind of shallow rooted, and it really takes a prepared seed bed to do well. These other ones you can drill no-till and it works just fine. So they're a lot less finicky, I would say, than teff is. So that's kind of how I would think about the various options for these warm season annuals. And again, I told you, I concentrate on grasses because they are the big biomass producers. You can add in other things, but just make sure that you're not taking away too much from the grass. And if you are planting mixes and you're really looking at kind of like an end harvest, not grazing in season, it's really hard to find things that can compete very well with those grasses. And so they tend to take over the stand anyways. And so you put a lot of money into seeds that don't really do much. Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out, because I think a lot of people think, for instance, sorghum Sudan or any of the warm seasons are low quality. And that's usually because of when it typically gets harvested. So if you are looking for higher quality, for instance, hay, then just harvest earlier. You're going to lose some yield, right? I mean, if you look at that little graph that I have there, it's very common, right? As it increases in maturity, your plant yield increases, but your quality decreases. That's just plant physiology. But what I think people underestimate is how good a quality these annuals can be in the early stages. So if you're using them for grazing, for instance, in that early vegetative stage, I mean, they are really high energy and high protein. So it can meet lactating cows' needs. And I would say these numbers are for sorghum, Sudan grass, pearl millet. It all fits those species. So high protein, high energy early, going down to late stages can be quite low energy and low protein. So you got to pick when you harvest, if you're going to harvest hay or silage based off of that balance between yield and quality. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about grazing because grazing management is extremely important for you to get the most out of annuals. And I have on here Sudan grass because that is my preferred grazing warm season. And there's a couple of things to think through. One of which is, as I said, they can produce prussic acid. And you can also get in the very short growth, you'll have prussic acid. So you really want to wait until Sudan grass is about 18 inches to 2 foot before you start grazing it. The other thing is that you really don't get to grazing height for typically about 45 days post-planting. But then you're going to have grass that is going to be growing fast. So like if I plant it now, in July, I'm going to be able to get on it, and I'm going to want to be being able to have a good rotation, because this is the other thing about all annuals. In my mind, most people who are really great at managing perennial grasses have a very hard time with annuals because it's a whole different world. So for annuals, they grow so fast, you do want to take them down a little bit harder. So like go down to 6 inches. So you went from 2 feet to 6 inches, and you want to rotate relatively fast so you don't let it get away from you and get too mature. It is very easy for annuals to grow so rapid that it's hard to keep up with. And in some cases, you may have to decide to pull some of the acres out of a grazing rotation and let them get mature so you can keep up with the other ones, because you'll get better regrowth and more total AUMs by doing that. And then you can go and hay, say, for instance, that extra acreage. Management is probably the key thing in terms of being able to make the most out of all annuals, to be honest. Warm seasons, you'll see it, I would say, more so. We typically estimate like a 40% grazing efficiency. But it can be a lot lower than that if it does get away from you, because they'll leave a lot of material, they'll knock a lot of material down. So I like to have at least 3 paddocks and do a 7 to 10 day rotation, but I might even break it down to 3 days at the peak growing season. So like mid-July, I might be going faster. So the next one I think I kind of wanted to talk about was late summer planting. So, all right, if we don't get it in July to early August, that's what I would suggest for warm seasons. I think if we go further west, in far western Nebraska, I would say it's probably the month of July. But here, say in eastern Nebraska, I could probably go with warm seasons up until about the 10th of August and probably out yield the next option, which is cool season, winter sensitive annual. So what those are, I'm talking about like oats or spring triticale or spring barley, and then the brassicas. So this is one where in this planting window, I really do like adding brassicas, and my particular favorite at the moment is rapeseed because it's cheap. And it's very, very high quality, and it will yield well. So I'm thinking about planting. The optimal kind of time in my mind is really planting about the 10th of August to about the 20th of August. And the reason why that window is a little bit narrow is that if we plant too early, especially these small cereals, they're actually temperature sensitive. And if you plant when it's still really warm, they'll want to go reproductive, even though they're not very, they haven't been planted very long. So they'll actually start shooting out stems too early. So we got to wait until it cools down a little bit to plant them. The other thing that I would suggest is if you are going to plant like in earlier August, then make sure you use a forage type small cereal. And the reason I suggest that, they're a little bit more expensive, but they have a later maturity, so they're going to stay higher quality longer, and you're going to get more total biomass out of them. When we start getting later into August, then it doesn't matter nearly as much because you don't have a very long growing window. And so using, say, a dual type, using, say, Jerry oats, for instance, really works just fine. You're not going to get too much benefit out of using the forage type oat in that window. So really about the 15th, 20th of August to about the 1st of September, that's the window where I would say, you know, a dual purpose oat works just fine, and find something that's a little bit lower cost. That's perfectly appropriate. So you kind of see that window I suggest is fairly narrow. And the reason after September 1st, it's time to move on to something that's winter hardy, which we'll talk about next. So the other thing that I want to point out, because this is not something I expected, and in fact, my thought process was incorrect about this. So when you use these winter sensitive species, one of the options, right, is to actually wait and not graze them until, you know, the winter time period. So in particular, I see this as a real advantage for something like weaning calves and putting weaned calves out there. The quality is really, really high. So what I have here, November 6th, when we measure the quality of an oat Brassica mix, it's 78% TDN. That's better than corn silage. Okay, so that's got more energy than corn silage in it, and it's got a crude protein of 23%. That's really darn good alfalfa hay, like dairy quality alfalfa hay. And you just put those two things together. Really high energy, really high protein, great feed. And it looks horrible after the frost. So the frost melts it down. It's not very tall anymore because it actually doesn't have any lignin. And lignin's that woody stuff that helps hold plants up, like, you know, your tree. But it's also indigestible. Well, it doesn't have any of that. That's why it's so high quality. So it kind of melts down, it turns brown, it looks bad, but it still retains a lot of its feed value. So here I have December 9th, and it's 67 TDN. That's not quite corn silage anymore. It's actually more like drought stress corn silage. So it's still fairly high energy. It's better than any hay you're ever going to have on hand. And it's still very, very high protein. We don't really lose a lot of protein. And we've done the same thing in January, and it holds about the same into January. So really great feed stuff. Looks can be deceiving. Just ignore how bad it looks. So it can be stockpiled and used later in the season. If you do that, one of my suggestions is that you make sure that you do something, maybe, you know, if you can do it 3-day allocations or week allocations, the more you do to reduce the access to that forage and trampling losses, the better off you're going to be in terms of stretching your forage resource. When we get a rain in that fall period or winter period, all that stockpile material can get trampled in, and you can lose a lot of forage very, very quickly. So limiting that access can really help a lot in making this a more profitable system. So the other thing I wanted to show you here is just an idea of what I kind of do for an oat Brassica mix. So I have on here 50 pounds of oats and 3 pounds per acre of rapeseed, and versus 100 pound of oats. And what this was mid-August to late August summer planting. We get the same yields from those seeding rates. And in terms of calf performance, we get a little bit more gain out of the oat Brassica mix. I know that doesn't seem like very much. It's not a whole lot, but the oat rapeseed mix is about $15 an acre, and that oat alone was about $23 an acre. So we had lower cost, similar yields, and a little bit higher quality feed. So to me, an oat rapeseed mix is kind of something that I really think can work very well in that time frame. Okay, so now let's move on here to thinking about fall planting. So as I said, after September 1st, just forget about it. You want to go with fall planting of something that's winter hardy, because you're just not going to get enough growth out of those winter sensitives to really be worth it. But planting the winter sensitives rather than the winter hardy in that August timeframe will result in more yield in the fall. So if you are looking for fall grazing, that's the reason why we suggest it. If you're really not, then go ahead and just wait and plant the winter hardy. Like September 15th, you can start thinking about planting those. Okay, so we have options for winter hardy species. We have cereal rye, winter wheat, winter triticale. Those are kind of the most common ones. And we can do two things with them, right? We can either use them for early spring grazing, like if we get them planted early. By the way, the earlier you plant them, up until about the 1st of September, the earlier you're going to have enough growth to actually get out in the spring if you want to graze early, like April. So we are often trying to target planting the 1st of October and then being able to graze like the 1st of April. This year was delayed. I think everybody saw the same thing where we were delayed in our turnout date. But it can fit a nice little window when we typically do not have grass available. You can also make silage out of it, and we're going to talk about that as well. Couple key pointers about species selection. I think everybody thinks cereal rye is lower quality than winter wheat, winter triticale. And I will argue, based off of our data, that the thing that matters is its stage at harvest, and so management is key. So in this case, I have a picture on here of some calves. These were 700-pound calves. They came off of stocks. They had been supplemented all winter. So this is not what I would call compensatory gain, but they gained 3.2 pounds a day on Elbon cereal rye. How did we do that? Well, we can consistently do it if we do two things. One is we have to stock heavy enough to keep that stuff immature. So you got to keep it vegetative. So having, at least a 2-paddock, if not a 3-paddock rotation is helpful. We typically, in eastern Nebraska are stocking about 3 calves an acre, and we move a lot. We may move between once every 3 days and once a week. And it's okay to graze it down fairly low, like get it down to 2 inches and move. It's a lot different than thinking about managing perennials. I always joke annuals can take a beating and keep on ticking. When it comes to grazing, it's really hard to graze out annuals. So let's talk a little bit now about the harvesting for silage, because that's something that's becoming more popular. And one of the key things I want to point out here is that I think there are a lot of differences in variety, and probably more impacts of variety than even species. When we look at rye, triticale, and wheat over time, so I've got here boot, pollination, milk, and soft dough. Boot would be before the head is even out. The head's actually below the first leaf, so you can kind of feel it in the stem. Pollination is basically at flowering, so when you see those little yellow anthers come out. Milk is when that seed head has a kernel in it, and if you pull that kernel out and you squeeze it, a milky white substance comes out. And then soft dough is when you take that kernel and you squeeze it, and now it's like a doughy substance. The thing I really wanted to show you is wheat didn't do quite as well in this particular study, and that might be the variety that we chose. This is pronghorn wheat, and really what we saw, why it trails off. Some of you might be looking at that and going, "What's going on there?" We had a lot of senescence or death of the leaves in the understory in that wheat when we went from milk to soft dough. So that's kind of why it declined. But in general, you see that yields increase as it gets more mature. I think everybody knows that. The one thing I do really want to show you is that, by delaying from boot to pollination, we really can get about 2 ton an acre yield increase in that rye or triticale. And for some people, if you're looking for more biomass, that can be an advantage. And you can still then fit in a next crop, because this is typically hitting pollination. Again, it depends a little bit on your planting date in the fall. but sometime around late May to very early June. This year we were delayed, and now we've really sped up. We're actually harvesting some soft dough right now. So it really does vary quite a bit from year to year. Go ahead to the next one, Jay. Okay, so let's talk about quality now, because we talked about quantity. And again, depending on what your goals are, you want to think about balancing quantity and quality. And I have on here the TDN, or the energy content of these species when we made silage out of them. And we really do not see very much for differences within the same stage across those species. So here's the thing. Everybody thinks rye is lower quality, and it is because of two things. One is that rye typically hits the stages a little bit earlier than triticale or wheat, but mostly it's like hitting boot and pollination earlier, and then it kind of slows down, and actually triticale and rye kind of seem to hold together towards milk and soft dough in terms of when they hit their stages. Wheat is actually delayed early, and then it actually speeds up. And so you actually have a shorter window to harvest wheat, it looks like, than rye or triticale, which was really interesting to me. But within a particular stage, there's not a lot of species effects. Now, if we look at the change over time, here's a couple key pointers. You're going to lose energy as you delay up until you hit milk, and then that starch formation will give you a little boost again back from milk to soft dough. So depending on the quality you're looking for, you're going to choose your stage. Now, for me, like as I was talking about that change from boot to pollination, I can gain about 2 tons, and I don't lose a lot of energy or protein. So from a balance standpoint, I kind of like pollination for most beef situations as a harvest timing, and then it fits to allow me to double crop something else. The other thing I wanted to point out is when, especially if you need a higher protein feed resource, these small cereals can be quite high protein. Boot stage, we're up there close to alfalfa. At pollination, we're at a really good grass hay stage. And you can kind of see that rye here was a little bit higher in some of the earlier stages over the last 2 years. These all received about 60 pounds of in the spring. So protein will vary a bit based off of nitrogen application. So if you do want a little bit higher, crude protein, putting on a little in helps. The other thing that in does that I think most people probably don't recognize, and it's another reason why rye seems to get away from people. If you don't fertilize, we see that the non-fertilized small cereals hit the maturity stages more quickly. So you shorten the window and you shorten the yield. So there's kind of two things there that's happening when you are not putting on nitrogen. So if you look at cover crops out there where they're not adding nitrogen, there's a reason why rye tends to be it's the most common cover crop. It also tends to be hitting maturity much more quickly. It's partially due to the species, but it's also a lot to do with the fertility. So which is kind of interesting to me, because I've always thought that rye was just so much earlier than triticale or wheat, and that's not actually the case when it has good fertility. It's just a little bit earlier. Okay, one other key tip is that we've seen taking samples from producer operations that there's a high percentage, it was almost 40% of the samples that we took that were too wet when they pack them. So these small cereals, you have to cut them and you need to let them wilt, and it didn't matter what stage. We had people going all the way from boot to soft dough, even soft dough, some of those were too wet. And if we are putting them up too wet, so talking about, anything 20 to 25% moisture or dry matter, 20 to 25% dry matter, we're going to be at risk for getting clostridial fermentation. And that's going to result in a lot of loss of energy value of that feed stuff. So you harvested it, you had the maximum amount of energy that you could at that particular stage, and then you can lose a lot of that in the fermentation process if you have the wrong type of bacteria and these are the Clostridial guys, they're the wrong type of bacteria to have, and they love those wet conditions. So the bottom line here is like these numbers were from producer sites, and we would take samples at Green Chop, and then after they had fermented, and you were seeing losses anywhere from 7 to almost 20. So this was 17% TDN units. So basically you could take something that was at, let's say, 65, and you could potentially bring it from a 65% TDN down to something that was like a 48, basically straw. Now that's the extreme example. On average, the loss was about 8 to 10 percentage units, but that's a significant amount of energy loss. So getting that moisture right is important. And I would say there was a large majority of people who basically overestimated the dryness of that material. So the bottom line is dry it longer. On average, a lot of people that were hitting the correct window were going from about 12 to 14 hours for the earlier stages. So talking about boot, pollination, and potentially milk. It does seem like year to year we get some variation in moisture content based off stage. But for milk and soft dough, a lot of times it's a shorter window, more like 2 to 4 hours for wilting. The last thing I have on here was the value of standing forage tools. So one of the things about annual forages is you might have a neighbor who has some crop ground or a cover crop, and you might want to be able to purchase that as a forage. And Jay, Darren, and I had worked on putting together a tool to kind of help you price that relative to corn silage. And Jay, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add.
No, not in particular, other than I've gotten comments from extension folks in other states that I know are using this to interact with producers, so that we've made a few tweaks to it based off of their comments. But my understanding is it's generally been pretty useful for people to basically answer that question of, I have forage standing in the field and I want to value it because somebody else is going to use it, buy it from me. So I think it's been pretty useful, but we're really, if anybody uses it and has any feedback, we'd be more than willing to listen to what you have and make it even more useful.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that too.
Okay, so we do have some time for some questions. If you have questions, you can put them in either the chat or the Q&A box on your screen, and then we can get to those questions. Mary, I do have one question for you, and that is basically the grazing versus harvesting thing. And do you see most people use annual forage with a commitment to one or the other, or how many people actually realistically go with the idea, I'm going to get some grazing out of it and then harvest it or something like that? I'm just curious how much of that actually goes on.
Actually, I would say there is a fair number of people who do graze, and they start out like early in the growth of that annual, grazing all of it, and then pulling aside some acres and haying, because just natural plant growth, right? Early on, it's kind of at the lower rate of growth. And so you need more acres to be able to maintain the same number of cows, for instance. And so then as it really hits its peak stride, like you actually need less acres. And so that makes it a great opportunity to be able to then get some hay out of that little, I would call it mid growth. Not like, you can't do that really late in the grazing season, but midway through, that's a really great thing. So I see a lot of that actually, that in the warm seasons in particular. It doesn't really work for the late summer planted stuff. You just can't get it to dry, to be honest. So that's pretty common for the warm seasons, and even I would say with the cool season winter hardies, so looking at the spring, that's not as common for that. Hay is hard to make out of those, just to be honest, partly because of the rainfall, but also because if you do want to hay it, you need an awnless variety. Those awns in the head on hay make it very unpalatable because they have it's basically like having little spikes. They don't want to eat it as well. So some people think, like, for instance, they don't like rye because they're like, it must be low quality. It's just not palatable if you make it as a hay. If you make it as a silage, it keeps it moist and those awns aren't a problem because they're more bendable, if that makes sense. So they're just not as spiky. So in that situation, what I see people doing is actually planting more acres and then pulling some out of the rotation early and actually just killing it and going to the next crop.
Okay. So the other question I have is pertaining to this year in particular, because we typically in a dry year get all these questions about early weaning, pulling pairs off and all those things. So if somebody were, and I know on the annual forage side, we typically talk about what you're putting out there. You're putting out there cows or growing calves.
Mm-hmm.
So any recommendations for folks that are looking at pairs, pulling pairs off of pasture into an annual forage? Is there any thoughts there in terms of things people should be looking at?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, as I mentioned, all annuals can be very high quality, right? So pairs can do really well on the warm seasons. So, if we had planted a warm season now or even earlier, it would be a great feed resource for the pairs at keeping it immature like you should be doing, to keep it regrowing so that you get the most out of it. But the same thing like that, the oat brassicas or even just oats alone that are planted in late summer, we've done pairs and breeding out on that. And so planting in early August, we were doing fall pairs. So we were breeding in October, November, and then we had another one where we were breeding in November, December. And there's two things that I'd like to tell you. One is that we get really good breed up. So that's not a problem. The other one was that we actually either maintained condition of those early lactating cows or even increased it on this stuff. So the quality is quite high. So that's pretty cool. So in my mind, I usually think about pairs like growing calves. If I say you could use it for growing calves, you can use it for pairs. If you're looking for something for dry cows, then you're like on that balance of yield versus quality, right? You're going to go higher yield and it's going to be lower quality. That's just fine. But grazing management will have a huge effect on how much you get out of it.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I hadn't thought of the fall calving aspect of it. So somebody with a split herd, they could be looking at the fall perhaps the fall calving cows, using those on some annual forages first for the breed up aspect of it. Yeah, that's interesting.
And if you have split herds, you have all kinds of opportunity to do things like letting those that are lactating take off the best and then making those dry cows clean up because quality tends to be very high.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. If any, I don't see any questions coming in, and I know that we're running close to the top of the hour. If anybody has any questions, just type them in real quick. If not, I'll just try to wrap up here. Mary, I don't know if you have some parting thoughts in terms of things to share with people, especially given this year's conditions and of course input costs being so high. You're going to ask me a market question, aren't you?
No, I was going to ask you a question actually about the insurance. What if I'm irrigated? So if I'm going to plant the annual forage on a pivot?
Yeah, that's interesting because that was one of the first questions I asked when I came across annual forage when I first came to Nebraska, and it turns out it's the same, right? So the insurance, because it's an index and based off of rainfall, they don't necessarily treat those differently. So you may want to treat it differently in terms of the productive value or the risk that you perceive there and the amount of insurance you want to put on it. But they treat dry land and irrigated pretty much the same when it comes to the annual forages. You're just attaching insurance based off of rainfall. And yeah, so I found that a little odd because I was like, why would people want to worry about rainfall insurance if it's irrigated? And of course, the theory is, well, you're going to have to irrigate more. And so they don't distinguish between that, and they're able to get away. I shouldn't say get away with that, but because it is an index policy, it doesn't really necessarily affect the insurance itself. It might affect how you want to utilize it, and how much insurance you actually want to put on. But yeah, it's a good question because a lot of people don't view that as, I get irrigated, it's got to be different. Other things are different. So PRF, and people who have used PRF know that, that's a little different when you do the irrigated stuff, but annual forage, they have it. So, yeah.
My one thought, you asked about the, current conditions, and And as we talked about earlier, that forage is hard to come by, feedstuffs are expensive. Nitrogen's very expensive, right? And my final thought here is that don't underestimate the value, even at $1 a pound in the growth that we get in current feed prices. It still might be worth it. Of course, with all nitrogen, the biggest bang for your buck is for the earliest amounts. So the lowest amounts give you the biggest bang for your buck, and return decreases as you go. So what you might consider is, how much is it worth, and saying, okay, maybe I'm only going to put on. We typically say for warm seasons, for instance, you'll hear split apply 50 pounds of N per acre. So 2 applications of that. I mean, maybe you bring that down, maybe even cut it in half, but it's probably still worth putting on some, because you're going to get most of the bang for your buck at those earliest amounts.
I'm going to make an economist out of you. Yeah, you're talking diminishing returns, diminishing marginal returns. So
I've only been working with you 8 years, so
yeah, it'll work. Okay, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and remind you that a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website, cap.unl.edu. You can also go there to register for any of our upcoming webinars and to access our archive of past webinars. Please click the link in the chat box to take a brief survey to provide feedback on today's webinar, and to give us any information you would like or suggestions for upcoming sessions and webinars. We're always interested not only in the topics, but also maybe in some interesting speakers that you heard talk and think would be good to share with our audience. So do not hesitate to let us know about that, and we'll do our best to track down and get the best speakers and the best topics on there for you guys. So thanks again for joining us today, and everybody have a pleasant day.